The Vietnam War was the longest and most divisive conflict in American history. It lasted nearly 20 years if counted from the first American military advisors to the final evacuation of Saigon. It cost 58,000 American lives and perhaps 3 million Vietnamese lives. It tore American society apart and left scars that remain visible today. The war began with seemingly noble intentions and ended in chaotic defeat. It was fought in the jungles and rice paddies of a small Southeast Asian nation most Americans had never heard of before. It became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when military power confronted political complexity. The roots of the Vietnam War stretch back far before American involvement. Vietnam had been a colony of France since the mid-19th century. The French called their Southeast Asian territories French Indochina. This included not only Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia. French colonial rule was harsh and exploitative. The Vietnamese people were subjected to forced labor, heavy taxation, and cultural suppression. Resistance movements emerged throughout the colonial period. But France maintained control through military force and political manipulation. World War II changed everything. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany. The collaborationist Vichy French government controlled what remained of unoccupied France. French Indochina suddenly became vulnerable. Japan, allied with Nazi Germany, moved forces into Vietnam in September 1940. The French colonial administration remained in place, but now served Japanese interests. Vietnam was occupied by two foreign powers simultaneously. This created opportunities for Vietnamese nationalist movements. The most significant of these movements was the Viet Minh. This organization was founded in 1941 by Ho Chi Minh and other Vietnamese nationalists. Ho Chi Minh had been born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890 in central Vietnam. He had traveled the world as a young man, living in France, the Soviet Union, and China. He had become a committed communist and anti-colonial revolutionary. But he was also a pragmatic nationalist who put Vietnamese independence above ideological purity. The Viet Minh combined communist ideology with nationalist appeal. It attracted support from peasants, intellectuals, and other groups opposed to foreign rule. During World War II, the Viet Minh fought against the Japanese occupation. They received some support from the American Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. American agents parachuted into Vietnam to work with Ho Chi Minh's forces. They provided weapons and training. The Americans saw the Viet Minh as allies against Japan. Ho Chi Minh admired certain aspects of American democracy. He quoted the American Declaration of Independence in his own Declaration of Vietnamese Independence. He hoped the United States would support Vietnam's independence after the war. Those hopes were disappointed. When World War II ended in August 1945, Vietnam declared its independence. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2, 1945. He did so in Hanoi before a crowd of hundreds of thousands. His declaration opened with words borrowed from the American founding fathers. He spoke of self-evident truths and inalienable rights. But the great powers had other plans for Vietnam. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allies had agreed to temporarily divide Vietnam. Chinese nationalist forces would occupy the north. British forces would occupy the south. This was meant to be temporary, just long enough to disarm the Japanese. The British forces in southern Vietnam took a different approach. They rearmed French prisoners of war and helped France reassert colonial control. The French were determined to reclaim their empire. They had lost their prestige and power during World War II. Restoring their colonial possessions seemed essential to recovering their status as a great power. By late 1945, French forces were fighting the Viet Minh in southern Vietnam. The First Indochina War had begun. This war lasted 9 years, from 1946 to 1954. It was a brutal conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The French had superior weapons and controlled the cities. The Viet Minh controlled much of the countryside and fought a guerrilla war. They ambushed French convoys, attacked isolated outposts, and melted back into the population. The French could not defeat an enemy they could barely find. The war drained France's resources and tested its will. French public opinion gradually turned against the conflict. The United States watched this war with growing concern. After World War II, America had emerged as a global superpower locked in competition with the Soviet Union. This Cold War dominated American foreign policy. American leaders viewed events around the world through the lens of communist expansion. When China fell to the communists in 1949, alarm bells rang in Washington. American policymakers feared a domino effect in Asia. If one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would fall as well. Vietnam seemed like the next domino. The United States began supporting France financially. By 1954, America was paying roughly 80% of France's war costs in Vietnam. This was not because Americans loved French colonialism. American policymakers generally disliked European imperialism. But they feared communism more. Supporting France seemed like the lesser evil. American military advisors began working with French forces. American weapons and equipment flowed to Vietnam. The United States was gradually being drawn into the conflict. The First Indochina War reached its climax at Dien Bien Phu. This was a French fortress in northwestern Vietnam near the border with Laos. The French commander, General Henry Navarre, chose this location for a major base. He wanted to lure the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle. The French believed their superior firepower would destroy the Viet Minh forces. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Viet Minh commander, General Vo Nguyen Giap, accepted the challenge. He moved artillery pieces into the mountains surrounding Dien Bien Phu. His forces dragged these heavy guns through jungle terrain the French thought impassable. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu began on March 13, 1954. Viet Minh artillery immediately knocked out the French airstrip. This cut off the garrison from resupply and reinforcement except by parachute drop. Viet Minh forces, numbering perhaps 50,000 men, surrounded the 13,000 French defenders. They dug trenches that gradually tightened the noose. The French fought desperately but were slowly overwhelmed. They appealed to the United States for help. The French wanted American airstrikes to relieve the siege. Some American officials, including Vice President Richard Nixon, advocated intervention. Admiral Arthur Radford proposed using nuclear weapons. President Dwight Eisenhower refused to intervene directly. He insisted on congressional approval and Allied support. Britain refused to participate. Congress was skeptical. Eisenhower would not act alone. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell. The French garrison surrendered. It was a humiliating defeat that ended France's will to continue the war. Peace talks had already begun in Geneva, Switzerland. The fall of Dien Bien Phu guaranteed that France would negotiate from weakness. The Geneva Accords were signed in July 1954. These agreements officially ended the First Indochina War. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam controlled the north. A separate government would control the south. Nationwide elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. Foreign military forces were to withdraw. The agreements were meant to provide a peaceful transition to Vietnamese independence and unity. The United States never signed the Geneva Accords. American officials objected to the terms and refused to be bound by them. More importantly, the United States had no intention of allowing the scheduled 1956 elections. American intelligence assessments concluded that Ho Chi Minh would win any free election. He was the most popular political figure in Vietnam, North and South. President Eisenhower himself later admitted that 80% of Vietnamese would have voted for Ho. Allowing such an election would mean a unified communist Vietnam. This was unacceptable to American policymakers. Instead, the United States threw its support behind a new government in South Vietnam. The leader was Ngo Dinh Diem, a Vietnamese nationalist and devout Catholic. Diem had been living in exile in the United States. He was strongly anti-communist and opposed to the Geneva Accords. American officials believed he could create a viable anti-communist state in South Vietnam. In 1955, Diem held a rigged referendum and proclaimed himself president of the Republic of Vietnam. The scheduled 1956 elections for reunification were never held. Vietnam remained divided. Diem's government faced enormous challenges from the beginning. South Vietnam was an artificial creation with no historical basis. It had no sense of national identity or legitimate institutions. Diem himself was a problematic leader. He was honest and personally incorruptible. But he was also authoritarian, nepotistic, and out of touch with ordinary Vietnamese. He filled key positions with family members. His brother Ngo Dinh Nhu ran the secret police. Another brother was the Catholic Archbishop. Diem favored Catholics over the Buddhist majority. He alienated much of the population. Opposition to Diem's government grew throughout the late 1950s. Some of this opposition was communist. Former Viet Minh fighters who had stayed in the South after the Geneva Accords began organizing resistance. Many were Southerners who had fought against France and now saw Diem as a puppet of new foreign masters. In 1960, these communist forces formed the National Liberation Front. The Diem government called them the Viet Cong, meaning Vietnamese communists. The name stuck in American usage. Not all opposition to Diem was communist. Many non-communist Vietnamese opposed his authoritarian rule. Buddhist monks protested his religious discrimination. Students demonstrated against corruption. Even elements of the military grew restless. Diem responded with harsh repression. His forces arrested thousands of suspected dissidents. Many were tortured or executed. Diem's strategic hamlet program forcibly relocated peasants into fortified villages. This was meant to separate them from Viet Cong influence. Instead, it created massive resentment among the rural population. The United States continued to support Diem despite growing concerns about his leadership. American military advisors in South Vietnam increased from a few hundred in the mid-1950s to several thousand by 1961. Their official role was to train and advise the South Vietnamese military. In practice, they increasingly took active roles in combat operations. American helicopters transported South Vietnamese troops into battle. American pilots flew combat missions. The line between advising and fighting blurred steadily. President John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961. He inherited the deteriorating situation in South Vietnam. Kennedy was a committed Cold Warrior who believed in containing communism. But he was also skeptical of large-scale military intervention. He preferred counterinsurgency and special forces operations. Kennedy increased the number of American advisors dramatically. By the end of 1963, more than 16,000 American military personnel were in South Vietnam. They were still officially advisors, not combat troops. But Americans were dying in combat with increasing frequency. The situation in South Vietnam continued to deteriorate. The Viet Cong grew stronger despite American aid and advice. Diem's government grew more repressive and more unpopular. In May 1963, a crisis erupted that would seal Diem's fate. The government banned the flying of Buddhist flags on the birthday of the Buddha. This was part of Diem's policy of promoting Catholicism over Buddhism. Buddhists protested in the city of Hue. Government forces fired on the protesters, killing 9 people. Buddhist protests spread across South Vietnam. On June 11, 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc committed self-immolation in a Saigon intersection. He sat in the lotus position while another monk poured gasoline over him. Then he lit himself on fire. He burned to death without moving or crying out. A journalist photographed the entire event. The image shocked the world. It dramatically illustrated the depth of opposition to Diem's government. More monks followed Thich Quang Duc's example in the following months. Diem's sister-in-law, Madame New, callously dismissed these deaths as barbecues. Her comments outraged international opinion. The Kennedy administration concluded that Diem had become a liability. He could not win the war against the Viet Cong. He was alienating the South Vietnamese population. American officials began quietly encouraging South Vietnamese generals to remove Diem from power. A military coup occurred on November 1, 1963. South Vietnamese generals surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and his brother New fled to a Catholic church in the Chinese district of Saigon. They were captured the next morning. Both were assassinated in the back of an armored personnel carrier. The exact circumstances remain disputed. The Kennedy administration had approved the coup but not the assassinations. When Kennedy learned of Diem's death, he was reportedly shocked and upset. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy himself was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson became president on November 22, 1963. Johnson inherited a war that was going badly. South Vietnam descended into political chaos after Diem's death. A series of military governments rose and fell in rapid succession. None could establish effective authority. The Viet Cong grew stronger and bolder. North Vietnam increased its support for the insurgency. American officials debated what to do next. Johnson faced a difficult choice. He could withdraw American support and let South Vietnam fall to communism. This was politically unacceptable. Republicans would accuse him of losing Vietnam just as Democrats had been accused of losing China. Alternatively, Johnson could dramatically increase American involvement. This meant sending American combat troops to fight a war in Asia. Johnson's advisors were divided. Some urged escalation. Others counseled caution or withdrawal. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 provided Johnson with the justification for escalation. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked the American destroyer USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, another attack was reported. This second attack almost certainly never happened. It was likely the result of radar errors and jumpy nerves. But Johnson presented both incidents as unprovoked attacks on American forces. He asked Congress for authorization to respond. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964. This gave the president authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only 2 senators voted against it. The resolution became the legal basis for the American war in Vietnam. Johnson would later say it was like grandmother's nightshirt. It covered everything. He had the authority he needed to escalate the war dramatically. Johnson held off on major escalation until after the 1964 presidential election. He ran as the peace candidate against Republican Barry Goldwater. Johnson promised he would not send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should fight. He won in a landslide. Then he did exactly what he had promised not to do. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked American installations in South Vietnam. Johnson ordered retaliatory bombing of North Vietnam. This was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It would continue for more than 3 years. In March 1965, Johnson sent the first official American combat troops to Vietnam. 2 battalions of Marines landed near Da Nang to protect the American air base there. They were the first of many. By the end of 1965, 184,000 American troops were in Vietnam. By the end of 1966, the number had grown to 385,000. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam. The United States was fully committed to a major ground war in Asia. The American military strategy was based on attrition. General William Westmoreland commanded American forces in Vietnam. He believed that superior American firepower could kill enemy forces faster than they could be replaced. The key metric was the body count. American forces would engage the enemy, kill as many as possible, and eventually break their will to fight. It was a strategy that had worked in previous American wars. In Vietnam, it would fail catastrophically. The American war machine descended on Vietnam with overwhelming force. Hundreds of thousands of young American men were drafted and sent to fight in a conflict most barely understood. They arrived in a country that seemed alien and hostile. The climate was oppressive, hot, and humid year-round. The terrain ranged from dense jungle to rice paddies to rugged mountains. The enemy was often invisible, blending into the civilian population. Traditional military tactics designed for conventional warfare proved inadequate for this new kind of conflict. American forces faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army fought a guerrilla war. They avoided large-scale battles when possible. They struck from ambush and then disappeared. They built an elaborate tunnel system underground. The Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon extended 400s of miles. Entire Viet Cong units lived underground, complete with hospitals, armories, and command centers. American soldiers literally walked over their enemies without knowing they were there. The enemy also controlled the tempo of combat. They chose when and where to fight. They attacked when they had advantage and withdrew when they did not. American forces conducted search and destroy missions, sweeping through areas looking for enemy forces. These operations produced high body counts but no lasting results. Once American forces left an area, the Viet Cong returned. The same ground was fought over repeatedly. There was no front line to advance and no territory to hold. Progress could not be measured in miles gained. General Westmoreland's strategy relied heavily on firepower. American forces had massive advantages in artillery, air support, and helicopter mobility. When contact was made with enemy forces, the standard response was to call in overwhelming firepower. Artillery batteries would pound suspected enemy positions. Fighter bombers would drop napalm and high explosives. B-52 bombers flying from bases in Thailand and Guam carpet-bombed large areas. The destructive power unleashed was staggering. But this firepower came at a terrible cost. Much of it fell on civilian areas. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were destroyed. The phrase, "we had to destroy the village in order to save it," became infamous. It supposedly came from an American officer explaining why a village had been leveled. Whether the quote was real or apocryphal, it captured the absurdity of the situation. American forces were devastating the country they claimed to be defending. Civilian casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The use of chemical weapons made the destruction worse. Agent Orange and other herbicides were sprayed over millions of acres. The goal was to deny the enemy cover by defoliating the jungle. It was also used to destroy crops in areas controlled by the Viet Cong. The program was called Operation Ranch Hand. Between 1961 and 1971, American aircraft sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over South Vietnam. Agent Orange contained dioxin, a highly toxic compound. It caused cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. The effects of Agent Orange are still being felt today. Millions of Vietnamese suffered health problems from exposure. So did hundreds of thousands of American soldiers who handled it or were exposed during operations. Children are still being born with birth defects linked to dioxin contamination. The environmental damage was catastrophic. Vast areas of forest were destroyed. Ecosystems were permanently altered. It was ecological warfare on a massive scale. Napalm was another weapon that caused horrific suffering. This jellied gasoline stuck to skin and burned at extremely high temperatures. It caused excruciating deaths and terrible injuries. Napalm was used extensively against suspected enemy positions, but it inevitably killed and wounded civilians as well. The image of Phan Thi Kim Phoc, a 9-year-old girl running naked down a road after a napalm attack, became one of the most iconic photographs of the war. Her clothes had been burned off. Her back was severely burned. The photograph shocked the world. American soldiers faced conditions that would break many of them. The average age of American combat soldiers in Vietnam was 19. These were young men, many barely out of high school. They were thrust into a nightmarish environment where death could come at any moment from any direction. Booby traps killed and maimed thousands. Punji stakes covered pits with sharpened bamboo claimed victims. Tripwires triggered grenades or mines. Even children could be enemies or used as weapons. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers could not tell friend from foe. A farmer working his rice paddy might be a Viet Cong fighter. A child selling trinkets might be carrying a grenade. The stress of constant vigilance and fear wore men down. Some turned to drugs. Marijuana was widely available and widely used. Heroin became a serious problem as the war dragged on. The military struggled to maintain discipline and combat effectiveness. Atrocities occurred on both sides, but American atrocities shocked the nation when they became public. The My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, was the most notorious. American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment killed between 347 and 500 for unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The victims included women, children, and elderly people. Some women were raped before being killed. Soldiers shot people at point-blank range and threw bodies into ditches. The massacre was covered up initially. It only became public in November 1969 when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story. The revelations horrified Americans. Lieutenant William Calley, the platoon leader, was court-martialed and convicted. He was initially sentenced to life in prison, but ultimately served only 3.5 years under house arrest. Many felt this was far too lenient. Others defended Calley as a scapegoat for failed policies. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of the war's moral corruption. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong committed atrocities as well. They executed South Vietnamese officials and suspected collaborators. They used terror tactics against civilians who refused to support them. During the Tet Offensive, Viet Cong forces executed thousands of civilians in the city of Hue. Mass graves were discovered after the city was retaken. But these atrocities received less attention in the American media. The focus was on what American forces were doing. The air war against North Vietnam was prosecuted with similar intensity. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965 and continued until November 1968. American aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties over North Vietnam. They targeted military installations, transportation infrastructure, and industrial facilities. The goal was to break North Vietnam's will to fight and stop the flow of supplies to the south. It failed on both counts. North Vietnamese air defenses were formidable. The Soviet Union and China supplied surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. They also provided training and technical support. American pilots faced some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire since World War II. Hundreds of American aircraft were shot down. Hundreds of pilots were killed or captured. Those captured faced years of brutal imprisonment. The Hanoi Hilton, Holo prison, became infamous for the torture of American prisoners of war. John McCain was one of the most famous American POWs. His plane was shot down in October 1967. He was badly injured during ejection, breaking both arms and a leg. He was beaten and tortured by his captors. He spent 5.5 years as a prisoner, much of it in solitary confinement. McCain refused early release because his father was a high-ranking admiral. He insisted on the military code that prisoners be released in the order they were captured. His ordeal, and that of other POWs, became a powerful symbol. The bombing of North Vietnam escalated over time. President Johnson personally approved targets, often choosing them in Tuesday lunch meetings at the White House. This micromanagement frustrated military commanders. They wanted to hit harder and with fewer restrictions. But Johnson feared that excessive bombing might bring China or the Soviet Union directly into the war. He tried to calibrate the bombing to apply pressure without triggering wider conflict. The restrictions meant that many strategic targets remained off limits. Hanoi and the port of Haiphong were subject to tight controls. The bombing was meant to send signals rather than achieve decisive military results. This gradualist approach satisfied no one. It was not enough to force North Vietnam to negotiate seriously. But it was more than enough to kill tens of thousands of North Vietnamese civilians. The bombing strengthened North Vietnamese resolve rather than breaking it. Meanwhile, the Ho Chi Minh Trail kept supplies flowing to the south. This was actually a complex network of trails and roads running through Laos and Cambodia. North Vietnamese forces moved supplies and troops down this trail system. They traveled at night and hid during the day. They built way stations and supply depots along the route. Despite massive American bombing, the trail was never cut. Supplies continued to reach Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in the south. The war expanded into Laos and Cambodia, though these operations remained secret from the American public for years. American aircraft bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos extensively. American and South Vietnamese forces conducted covert operations in both countries. The goal was to disrupt enemy supply lines and sanctuaries. Instead, these operations destabilized both nations and contributed to their eventual fall to communist forces. Back in the United States, opposition to the war was growing. The anti-war movement started small in the early 1960s. It was initially confined to pacifists, leftist activists, and some religious groups. As the war escalated and casualties mounted, the movement grew rapidly. College campuses became centers of protest. Students demonstrated against the draft and military recruiters. Some burned their draft cards in public acts of defiance. The draft became increasingly controversial. It was not applied equally across society. College students could receive deferments, allowing them to avoid service while pursuing their education. This meant the burden fell disproportionately on working class and poor young men. African Americans were drafted at higher rates than their percentage of the population. They also suffered higher casualty rates in combat. The inequity fueled resentment and protest. Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight boxing champion, refused induction into the military in 1967. He claimed conscientious objector status based on his Muslim faith. He famously said he had no quarrel with the Viet Cong. Ali was stripped of his boxing title and faced prosecution. He became a symbol of resistance to the war. His case eventually reached the Supreme Court, which overturned his conviction in 1971. But by then, Ali had lost 3.5 years of his boxing prime. Martin Luther King Jr. came out against the war in 1967. King had initially avoided taking a public stance, fearing it would alienate President Johnson and hurt the civil rights movement. But he could no longer remain silent. In his speech beyond Vietnam delivered at Riverside Church in New York, King called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He linked the war to racism and economic injustice. King's opposition gave the anti-war movement greater moral authority and broader appeal. The anti-war movement was diverse and sometimes divided. It included pacifists who opposed all war, leftists who supported North Vietnam, liberals who thought the war was unwinnable, and others with various motivations. Tactics ranged from peaceful marches to violent confrontations. Most protests were peaceful, but some radicals engaged in property destruction and clashes with police. The Weather Underground, a militant splinter group, conducted bombing campaigns against government and military targets. Major protests occurred in cities across America. In October 1967, 100,000 people marched on the Pentagon. Some protesters tried to levitate the building through meditation, an absurd but symbolic gesture. Thousands sat down in front of the building and were arrested. Norman Mailer wrote about the march in his book, The Armies of the Night, which won the Pulitzer Prize. The event showed the anti-war movement's growing strength and diversity. The media played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Vietnam was the first war extensively covered on television. Every evening, Americans watched footage of combat and casualties during the dinner hour news. The phrase living room war captured this phenomenon. The images were often graphic and disturbing. They brought the reality of war into American homes in unprecedented ways. Television coverage generally supported the war effort in the early years. But as the war dragged on with no end in sight, coverage became more critical. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, turned against the war in 1968. After visiting Vietnam following the Tet Offensive, Cronkite concluded the war was unwinnable. In a special broadcast, he said the only rational way out was to negotiate, not as victors but as honorable people. President Johnson reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. The comment may be apocryphal, but it captured the significance of Cronkite's shift. The Tet Offensive in early 1968 was the war's major turning point. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Both sides traditionally observed a ceasefire during Tet. On January 30th, 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces broke the ceasefire. They launched coordinated attacks on cities and military bases across South Vietnam. More than 80,000 enemy troops participated in the offensive. They struck at more than 100 targets simultaneously. The attacks shocked American military and political leaders. The enemy was supposed to be losing, worn down by attrition. Intelligence had missed the massive buildup. The most dramatic attack came in Saigon. Viet Cong commandos blasted a hole in the wall surrounding the American embassy. They fought their way into the embassy compound. For 6 hours, they battled American guards and military police. All 19 attackers were killed and the embassy was secured, but the psychological damage was done. The ancient city of Hue was captured by North Vietnamese forces. They held it for nearly a month. Bitter house-to-house fighting was required to retake the city. Much of Hue was destroyed in the battle. Thousands of civilians were killed. The Communists executed South Vietnamese officials, military officers, and others they considered enemies. Mass graves containing thousands of bodies were discovered later. The Battle of Hue became one of the war's bloodiest engagements. At Khe Sanh, a Marine base near the demilitarized zone, North Vietnamese forces laid siege. The siege lasted 77 days. The Marines held out, supplied entirely by air. American commanders feared Khe Sanh would become another Dien Bien Phu. Massive air power was brought to bear. B-52s dropped thousands of tons of bombs around the base. The North Vietnamese eventually withdrew, and the siege was lifted. Then the Americans abandoned the base anyway, raising questions about why they had defended it so fiercely. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the Communists. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked. They suffered enormous casualties, perhaps 45,000 killed. The Viet Cong in particular was devastated and never fully recovered. North Vietnamese regular forces would increasingly carry the burden of fighting in subsequent years. By conventional military metrics, Tet was an American victory. But it was a political and psychological disaster. The American public had been told the war was being won. General Westmoreland had said the enemy was nearly defeated. Now the enemy had attacked everywhere at once. They had penetrated the American embassy in Saigon. If this was victory, what would defeat look like? Public support for the war plummeted. President Johnson's approval ratings collapsed. The credibility gap between official statements and reality became a chasm. In the wake of Tet, Johnson faced a political crisis. Senator Eugene McCarthy challenged him for the Democratic presidential nomination. McCarthy ran as an anti-war candidate. In the New Hampshire primary in March 1968, McCarthy won 42% of the vote. Johnson won, but his narrow margin was seen as a defeat. Senator Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, then entered the race. He also opposed the war. Johnson faced the prospect of a bruising primary battle he might lose. On March 31, 1968, Johnson addressed the nation on television. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam. He called for peace negotiations. Then, at the end of his speech, he shocked the country. He said he would not seek and would not accept his party's nomination for another term as president. Johnson was withdrawing from politics. The war had destroyed his presidency. The man who had won the greatest landslide in American history 4 years earlier was being driven from office. The year 1968 became one of the most turbulent in American history. The Tet Offensive had shattered illusions about the war. President Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race left the political landscape in chaos. The anti-war movement gained momentum and mainstream acceptance, but the country was deeply divided. Supporters of the war felt betrayed by media coverage and anti-war protesters. They believed America was on the verge of victory when the political will collapsed. The cultural and political divisions of 1968 would shape American society for generations. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, sent shockwaves through the nation. King was shot by James Earl Ray while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots erupted in more than 100 American cities. Entire neighborhoods burned. The National Guard was deployed to restore order. The violence killed dozens and caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. The murder of the apostle of nonviolence seemed to symbolize America's descent into chaos. Robert Kennedy emerged as the leading anti-war candidate for the Democratic nomination. He won the California primary on June 5, 1968. That night, he gave a victory speech to supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. As he left through the hotel kitchen, a gunman shot him. The assassin was Sirhan, a Palestinian who opposed Kennedy's support for Israel. Kennedy died the next day. Major assassinations in 2 months devastated the nation. The political center seemed to be collapsing. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August 1968 descended into violence. Anti-war protesters gathered outside the convention hall. Chicago's mayor, Richard Daley, deployed massive police forces. Confrontations between police and protesters turned brutal. Police beat demonstrators with clubs. Television cameras captured the violence. Inside the convention hall, delegates nominated Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey had not entered any primaries, but secured the nomination through backroom dealing. Anti-war Democrats felt cheated and betrayed. The violence in Chicago appalled many Americans, but it also created a backlash against the protesters. Many viewed the demonstrators as unpatriotic troublemakers. The chaos helped Republican candidate Richard Nixon. Nixon ran on a platform of law and order and promised to end the war with honor. He claimed to have a secret plan to end the war. He never revealed what this plan was. Nixon appealed to what he called the silent majority, Americans who supported the war effort and opposed the anti-war movement. Nixon won the 1968 election narrowly. He defeated Humphrey by less than 1 percentage point in the popular vote. But Nixon won decisively in the Electoral College. Third-party candidate George Wallace, running on a segregationist platform, won 5 southern states. Wallace's strong showing demonstrated the racial tensions tearing at American society. Nixon took office in January 1969, facing the challenge of ending the war without appearing to lose it. Nixon's strategy for ending the war was called Vietnamization. The idea was to gradually withdraw American forces while building up South Vietnamese capabilities. The South Vietnamese military would take over combat responsibilities from the Americans. This would allow the United States to exit the war while maintaining a non-communist South Vietnam. It was a face-saving strategy that attempted to square an impossible circle. The South Vietnamese government and military had proven incapable of defending themselves for years. There was little reason to believe more training and equipment would fundamentally change this. Nixon's national security advisor was Henry Kissinger, a Harvard professor and foreign policy expert. Kissinger became the architect of Nixon's Vietnam policy. He pursued a complex strategy combining military pressure with diplomatic negotiations. Secret peace talks with North Vietnam had begun under Johnson. Kissinger took over these negotiations. He met repeatedly with Le Duc, though, the North Vietnamese negotiator. The talks made little progress initially. Each side demanded concessions the other would not make. Meanwhile, Nixon escalated the war in significant ways despite his promises to end it. In March 1969, he authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia. American B-52s struck communist base areas and supply routes along the Cambodian border. The bombing was kept secret from the American public and even from most of Congress. Only a handful of officials knew about it. The bombing of neutral Cambodia violated international law, but Nixon argued it was necessary to protect American forces and pressure North Vietnam. The secret bombing of Cambodia continued for more than a year before becoming public. When it was revealed, it sparked outrage. Critics accused Nixon of expanding the war after promising to end it. The administration justified the bombing as necessary to protect American troops during withdrawal. But the bombing killed thousands of Cambodian civilians. It also pushed Cambodia's fragile government toward collapse. The Khmer Rouge, Cambodian communists, gained support by exploiting anger at American bombing. In April 1970, Nixon expanded operations in Cambodia even further. American and South Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia in a major ground operation. The goal was to destroy communist base areas and supply depots. Nixon announced the invasion in a televised address. He called Cambodia a privileged sanctuary that the enemy had used too long. The invasion was presented as necessary to protect American forces and ensure successful Vietnamization. It had the opposite effect on the American home front. The Cambodian invasion sparked the largest anti-war protests yet. College campuses across America erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard was deployed to control protests. On May 4, 1970, guardsmen fired into a crowd of students. They killed for students and wounded 9 others. Some of those killed were simply walking to class. The Kent State shooting shocked the nation. The image of a young woman kneeling over a dead student's body became iconic. It seemed to confirm the anti-war movement's claim that the government was waging war against its own people. 10 days later, police killed the students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. This historically black college had also seen anti-war protests. Police fired into a women's dormitory, killing 2 and wounding 12. The Jackson State killings received far less media attention than Kent State. Many saw this as evidence of racial bias in coverage. But the 2 incidents together intensified opposition to the war. More than 400 colleges and universities shut down completely in May 1970. Student strikes and protests paralyzed campuses across the country. The anti-war movement reached its peak in the early 1970s. It had become mainstream. Veterans who had fought in Vietnam joined the protests. Vietnam veterans against the war became a powerful voice. In April 1971, hundreds of veterans gathered in Washington and threw their medals and ribbons onto the steps of the Capitol. John Kerry, a decorated Navy veteran who would later become Secretary of State, testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He asked how you could ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake. The publication of the Pentagon Papers in June 1971 further eroded support for the war. The Pentagon Papers were a secret Defense Department study of American involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst who had worked on the study, leaked it to the New York Times. The documents revealed that multiple administrations had systematically lied to the American public about the war. They showed that officials knew the war was unwinnable but continued it anyway. They exposed the gap between private doubts and public optimism. The Nixon administration tried to prevent publication of the Pentagon Papers. They argued it would harm national security. The case went to the Supreme Court. The court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspaper's right to publish. It was a landmark victory for press freedom. But the Pentagon Papers further damaged the government's credibility. They confirmed what many had suspected. The government had been lying about Vietnam for years. Public trust in government, already low, dropped even further. Nixon responded to leaks and protests by expanding government surveillance and dirty tricks. He created a secret unit called the Plumbers to stop leaks. This unit broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office seeking damaging information. They conducted other illegal operations. These activities were early steps toward the Watergate scandal that would eventually destroy Nixon's presidency. Vietnam and Watergate became intertwined. The same mindset that led to escalation in Vietnam led to criminality at home. The air war against North Vietnam had been halted in 1968 as a gesture toward peace negotiations. Nixon resumed bombing in 1972 after negotiations stalled. Operation Linebacker began in May 1972 after North Vietnam launched a major offensive in the South. American aircraft struck targets throughout North Vietnam with fewer restrictions than before. Ports were mined to prevent supply ships from reaching North Vietnam. The bombing was intense and destructive. Operation Linebacker came in December 1972. This was even more intense than the earlier campaign. For 12 days, American B-52s carpet-bombed Hanoi and Haiphong. The Christmas bombing, as it became known, was meant to force North Vietnam to agree to peace terms. Hundreds of North Vietnamese civilians were killed. 15 B-52s were shot down, a significant loss. International condemnation was severe. Even American allies criticized the bombing as excessive and brutal. The bombing did help push negotiations toward conclusion. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong all signed the agreement. It called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of all American forces. North Vietnamese forces could remain in place in South Vietnam. Political questions about South Vietnam's future were left unresolved. Prisoners of war would be exchanged. The agreement was essentially a face-saving device that allowed the United States to withdraw. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the agreement. Le Duc Tho refused to accept it, saying peace had not actually been achieved. He was right. The agreement was built on contradictions and unresolved issues. It satisfied no one. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu felt betrayed by the terms. He believed the United States was abandoning South Vietnam. He signed the agreement only under intense American pressure. North Vietnam saw the agreement as temporary. They would wait for American forces to leave and then finish the war. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March 1973. The last American prisoners of war were released and returned home. Americans held emotional homecoming celebrations for the returning foes. But the broader reception for Vietnam veterans was often cold. Unlike veterans of previous wars, Vietnam veterans returned individually rather than as units. There were no victory parades. Many faced hostility or indifference. Some were spat on or called baby killers. Most Americans just wanted to forget about Vietnam. The experience of Vietnam veterans would haunt American society for decades. Many suffered from what was then called post-traumatic stress disorder, though it was not formally recognized until years later. Veterans struggled with flashbacks, nightmares, and difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Divorce rates, unemployment, and suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were all elevated. The VA system was unprepared to deal with the mental health crisis. Many veterans felt abandoned by the country they had served. The war continued in Vietnam after American withdrawal. The ceasefire never really took hold. Fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces continued. The United States provided military aid and air support to South Vietnam. But American commitment was waning. Congress became increasingly reluctant to fund the war. The Watergate scandal consumed Nixon's presidency. In August 1974, Nixon resigned to avoid impeachment. His successor, Gerald Ford, had neither the political capital nor the public support to maintain American involvement. North Vietnam prepared for a final offensive. In early 1975, they launched attacks to test South Vietnamese responses. The South Vietnamese military began to collapse with shocking speed. Entire divisions disintegrated, soldiers abandoned their positions and fled. The government in Saigon panicked. By March 1975, North Vietnamese forces were advancing rapidly. Cities fell in quick succession. The South Vietnamese government appealed desperately for American help. But Congress refused to authorize more military aid. America was finished with Vietnam. The fall of Saigon came in April 1975. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the capital. The South Vietnamese government collapsed. Chaos gripped the city. Thousands of Vietnamese who had worked with Americans feared communist retribution. They desperately sought evacuation. The American embassy was overwhelmed. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation in history. For 19 hours, helicopters shuttled between downtown Saigon and aircraft carriers offshore. The iconic image of the war's end was a helicopter on a rooftop. Vietnamese civilians climbed a ladder trying to reach it. The photo was actually taken at an apartment building, not the embassy. But it symbolized America's desperate exit. American personnel had to fight off Vietnamese trying to board helicopters. Some people clung to helicopter skids as they took off. They fell to their deaths. American Marines pushed helicopters off carrier decks to make room for more arriving. The evacuation was chaotic. desperate and humiliating. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The last South Vietnamese president, Duong Van Minh, surrendered unconditionally. He had been in office for only 48 hours. The war was over. North Vietnam had won. South Vietnam ceased to exist. The country was reunified under communist control. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The United States had lost its first war. The cost of the war was staggering. Approximately 58,000 American service members died. More than 300,000 were wounded. Thousands more were psychologically scarred. The financial cost exceeded $160 billion, equivalent to well over $1 trillion today. But the Vietnamese losses dwarfed the American casualties. Estimates of Vietnamese deaths vary widely. Between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese died, including soldiers and civilians from both North and South. The exact number will never be known. The physical destruction of Vietnam was immense. American bombing had cratered the landscape. Forests had been defoliated and burned. Cities and villages had been destroyed. The country's infrastructure was in ruins. Millions of unexploded bombs, mines, and artillery shells remained buried in Vietnamese soil. They continue to kill and maim people today. The environmental damage from Agent Orange persists. Children are still born with birth defects linked to dioxin exposure. Cambodia and Laos also paid terrible prices for the war's expansion. American bombing of Cambodia had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. It destabilized the country and contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge took power in April 1975, the same month Saigon fell. They immediately implemented radical policies. They emptied cities and forced people into agricultural labor camps. Over the next 4 years, the Khmer Rouge killed approximately 2 million Cambodians through execution, starvation, and disease. It was genocide. Laos also fell to communist forces in 1975. The country had been devastated by American bombing. The United States dropped more bombs on Laos than on Germany and Japan combined during World War II. This made Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. Much of the bombing targeted the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it also struck villages and civilian areas. Thousands of Laotians died. The communist Pathet Lao took control and established a repressive government that still rules today. The fall of Saigon traumatized the American psyche. For the first time, the United States had been defeated in war. The image of helicopters fleeing Saigon haunted the national consciousness. The Vietnam War became synonymous with failure and hubris. It demonstrated the limits of American military power. It showed that superior weapons and resources could not guarantee victory. It revealed that willpower and political commitment were as important as firepower. The fall of Saigon marked the end of America's direct involvement in Vietnam. But the war's aftermath would shape American society for decades. The wounds were deep and slow to heal. America had to process its first military defeat and the moral questions it raised. The Vietnam War became a reference point for all subsequent American foreign policy debates. Its shadows extend to present-day discussions about military intervention and national identity. The most immediate concern after the war was the fate of those who had supported America. Vietnamese who had worked with Americans feared communist retribution. Approximately 125,000 Vietnamese refugees were evacuated during the final days. They came from various backgrounds. Some were former South Vietnamese officials and soldiers. Others were educators, journalists, and business people. Many were Catholic, having fled communist rule in North Vietnam 2 decades earlier. They arrived in America with little but their lives. The Vietnamese diaspora scattered across the United States and other countries. California, especially Orange County, became a major center. Texas, Virginia, and other states also received significant numbers. The refugees faced cultural and linguistic challenges. They had been educated in French or American systems. Many had professional training that did not transfer easily. They rebuilt their lives from nothing. Their story of escape and adjustment would be repeated with other refugee groups in subsequent decades. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese who could not escape faced uncertain fates. Many were sent to re-education camps. These were essentially prisons where former South Vietnamese officials and soldiers were held. Conditions varied but were generally harsh. Those who had collaborated with Americans were singled out for punishment. Some were executed, others died from disease or mistreatment. The re-education camps were eventually closed, but the suffering they caused weighed on the new communist regime. The American POW and MIA issue became a national obsession. During the war, hundreds of Americans had been captured and held as prisoners of war. Most were released in 1973 as part of the peace agreements. But some Americans were never accounted for. The United States government declared that some were missing in action. The families of these missing men demanded answers. They lobbied Congress and presidents for more aggressive efforts to find their loved ones. The issue of living Americans still held in Vietnam became a political football. Presidents from both parties made it a priority to raise the matter with Hanoi. North Vietnam used the POW and MIA question as diplomatic leverage. They released additional American remains periodically. Each return was a ceremony designed to show good faith. Some remains could not be identified. Some were definitely American. Others might have been remains of other nationalities. The processing was slow and often unsatisfying. For decades, some Americans believed their loved ones were still alive in Vietnamese prisons. Stories circulated of Americans who had escaped and were being hidden. The government was accused of abandoning them. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some families spent their lives searching for answers. The truth was usually more mundane than the theories. Most missing Americans had died in captivity or in the jungle. Their remains had been buried or lost. The few possible survivors were almost certainly cases of mistaken identity. The VA system struggled to handle the influx of Vietnam veterans. Mental health services were particularly inadequate. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was not formally recognized until 1980, but Vietnam veterans had clearly been profoundly affected by their experiences. They suffered from flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbing. Many self-medicated with alcohol or drugs. Divorce rates and suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were elevated for decades after the war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington became the defining monument to the war. Maya Lin, a Yale architecture student, designed the monument. It was a simple V-shaped wall of black granite. The names of more than 58,000 American dead were inscribed on its surface. The design was controversial when it was selected. Some criticized its color and lack of ornamentation. But the memorial became deeply meaningful to veterans and the public. It became the most visited monument in Washington. The memorial's black granite reflected the viewer, creating a sense of connection with the dead. The V-shape forced visitors to walk between two walls that gradually rose above them. Names were arranged chronologically by date of death. This meant visitors walking the wall walked through the war's timeline. It was designed to be read, not superficially observed. Veterans and families found profound meaning in the memorial. It became a site of pilgrimage and healing for many. The controversy over the memorial's design led to additional monuments. A bronze statue of 3 servicemen was added nearby. It depicted figures that were deliberately racially ambiguous. A woman's statue, the Vietnam Women's Memorial, was added to honor the 11,000 women who served in Vietnam as nurses and in other support roles. These monuments humanized the wall's stark geometry. Veterans groups became a significant political force. The American Legion and veterans of foreign wars had long existed, but Vietnam veterans created their own organizations. Vietnam Veterans Against the War had initially been radical, demanding immediate withdrawal. Later, organizations like the Vietnam Veterans Foundation took more mainstream approaches. They focused on veterans' benefits and representation. They lobbied for better healthcare and disability benefits. The Agent Orange issue became a major cause for veterans. They had been exposed to herbicides during their service. They developed cancer and other diseases at elevated rates. Their children were born with birth defects. The VA initially denied any connection. Decades of scientific research gradually established links. Today, the VA recognizes numerous conditions as service-connected for Agent Orange exposure. But the battle for acknowledgement took decades. The broader American culture processed the war through books, movies, and music. The first major Vietnam War films appeared while the war was still ongoing. They tended to be critical. Apocalypse Now 1979 and Platoon 1986 became landmarks. They explored the psychological damage of the war. They questioned American justifications and actions. Later films like Full Metal Jacket 1987 examined the training and dehumanization of soldiers. This cinema shaped public understanding of the war. The music of the era reflected the divisions. Folk musicians like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan wrote anti-war protest songs. Rock bands like The Doors and Jimi Hendrix incorporated Vietnam themes. The Beatles' Give Peace a Chance became an anti-war anthem. Country artists wrote songs supporting the soldiers while criticizing the war's conduct. This music was the soundtrack to the era's protests and debates. The Vietnam War changed America's relationship with the military. Before Vietnam, military service was seen as honorable and normal. After Vietnam, the all-volunteer force replaced the draft. This meant only those who chose to serve would fight. This created a different relationship between the military and society. The military became more professional and separate from civilian life. The divides between those who served and those who did not grew. American foreign policy underwent fundamental changes. The lesson many policymakers drew from Vietnam was to avoid another ground war in Asia. This became known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Presidents were reluctant to commit large numbers of ground troops to foreign adventures. When the Persian Gulf crisis arose in 1990, George H.W. Bush was determined to build an international coalition. He wanted overwhelming force and clear exit strategies. The Vietnam experience weighed heavily on his calculations. The war also influenced how America viewed human rights. The revelations of atrocities like My Lai damaged American moral authority. America's Cold War arguments about defending freedom against communism were harder to make. The human rights movement gained ground after Vietnam. America had to reconcile its ideal image with its actual conduct. This tension continued in subsequent foreign policy debates. The normalization of relations with Vietnam took another 20 years. The United States maintained an embargo on trade with Vietnam for decades. The country remained officially communist, but reforms gradually changed Vietnamese society. Doi Moi, the reform program launched in 1986, moved toward market economics. The aging communist leadership began reaching out to America. Visits and negotiations gradually thawed relations. In 1995, President Bill Clinton formally normalized diplomatic relations with Vietnam. The two countries reopened embassies and exchanged ambassadors. The normalization was controversial. Families of POWs and MIAs opposed it. They feared it would stop efforts to account for the missing. But normalization proceeded. It opened trade and cultural exchange. It allowed America to engage with the former enemy. Today, Vietnam is a potential trading partner and strategic partner. American companies invest in Vietnam. Vietnamese goods flow to American markets. The war that defined an era has faded into memory and history. But the issues it raised about American power, moral authority, and foreign intervention remain relevant. Every subsequent debate about military action invokes the Vietnam example. Vietnamese Americans have become a significant community. They number in the millions today. They have succeeded in American business, academia, and politics. They have created vibrant communities that maintain cultural traditions while adapting to American life. The children and grandchildren of refugees have made peace with their dual identity. They honor their parents' and grandparents' escape while embracing their new home. The Cambodian genocide that followed America's withdrawal cast its own shadow. The Khmer Rouge regime murdered approximately 2 million Cambodians. The killing fields became a symbol of the war's regional impact. America had bombed Cambodia extensively. The destabilization contributed to the Khmer Rouge's rise. When the regime was finally overthrown by Vietnamese forces in 1979, America opposed the Vietnamese intervention. This allowed the Khmer Rouge to retain Cambodia's UN seat for years. The wounds in Cambodia never fully healed. The Khmer Rouge leaders were finally brought to trial in the 2010s. The Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, a hybrid Cambodian international tribunal, prosecuted them. Several top leaders were convicted, but Duke, the infamous prison chief, showed no remorse. The trials provided some closure, but not real justice for most victims. The Laotian experience was similarly grim. The most heavily bombed country per capita in history remained poor and isolated for decades. Unexploded ordnance continued to kill and maim civilians. American investment in clearing bombs made progress but was slow. The country opened to tourism only in the 1990s. The domestic political fallout from Vietnam shaped American politics for a generation. Watergate and Vietnam took down the Nixon presidency. The Democratic Party was torn apart by the war. The Republican Party united around opposition to the war. The realignment of American politics that began in the 1960s was completed in the 1970s. The political map that emerged would define American politics for decades. Jimmy Carter won the 1976 presidential election in part by promising never to lie to the American people. His presidency was shaped by the Vietnam experience. He prioritized human rights in foreign policy. He sought to move beyond the Cold War, but Carter's presidency faced its own crises. The Iranian Revolution and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan forced America back toward confrontation. The post-Vietnam restraint was already giving way to renewed competition. The lessons of Vietnam were debated constantly in American foreign policy circles. The realists and the idealists disagreed. The realists emphasized the limits of military power. They argued America should pick its fights carefully. The idealists believed America had a responsibility to promote democracy and human rights. They argued America could not retreat from the world. These debates would continue through subsequent presidents and crises. The question of whether America won or lost the war became almost beside the point. America had attempted to prevent communist takeover of South Vietnam. It had failed. America had promised to defend its allies and friends. It had abandoned them. The credibility of American commitments was questioned worldwide. For years, American diplomats had to reassure allies that America would stand by its word. This doubt would affect American foreign policy for decades. The Vietnam veteran experience eventually improved. The Vietnam Veterans Act of 1974 provided health care and benefits. Later legislation expanded coverage. The VA system gradually improved its handling of Agent Orange claims. PTSD was eventually recognized. The nation gradually came to terms with its treatment of veterans. By the 1980s and 1990s, Vietnam veterans were being honored at ceremonies and in veteran memorials. The 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon in 2025 prompted reflection. Americans looked back at their longest war with new perspectives. Vietnamese Americans commemorated their parents' escapes and new beginnings. Veterans processed their experiences in therapy and group sessions. Politicians debated the lessons for current conflicts. The war that had defined a generation had become history. Contemporary foreign policy debates constantly invoke Vietnam. The question of whether America should intervene in Syria or Ukraine recalls the Vietnam debates. The question of whether Afghanistan was another Vietnam recurred in the conflict's discussions. The ghosts of Vietnam continue to haunt American policy. The images of helicopter evacuations and body counts shaped how Americans viewed military action. The war's environmental legacy continues today. Agent Orange contamination remains in Vietnamese soil. Children are still born with defects linked to dioxin. Americans are funding cleanup efforts. Progress is slow but being made. The environmental damage may outlast the political memory of the war itself. The Vietnam War's legacy extends far beyond the battlefield and the diplomatic agreements that ended it. The conflict fundamentally altered how Americans view military intervention, government credibility, and national purpose. The war exposed deep fractures in American society that persist today. It challenged assumptions about American exceptionalism and invincibility. The generation that fought the war and the generation that protested it both carry scars. Understanding Vietnam remains essential to understanding modern America. The war profoundly affected American military doctrine and organization. The Pentagon studied Vietnam extensively to understand what went wrong. Military leaders concluded that political micromanagement had hampered military effectiveness. They argued that President Johnson's gradual escalation had been a mistake. They believed overwhelming force applied quickly would have achieved better results. This thinking influenced the development of the Powell Doctrine in the 1990s. General Colin Powell argued that military force should only be used when vital interests were at stake. When force was necessary, it should be overwhelming and decisive. The Weinberger Doctrine, articulated by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger in 1984, also reflected Vietnam's lessons. Weinberger outlined 6 tests for committing American forces. There must be vital interests at stake. There must be clear objectives. Forces must be sized to achieve those objectives. The relationship between objectives and forces must be continually reassessed. There must be reasonable assurance of public and congressional support. Force should be a last resort. These criteria were designed to prevent another Vietnam-style quagmire. The military itself underwent transformation after Vietnam. The draft ended in 1973, replaced by the all-volunteer force. This professionalized the military and changed its relationship with society. Without conscription, military service became a choice rather than an obligation. The burden of service fell on a smaller segment of society. Military families often produced multiple generations of service members. The gap between military and civilian culture widened over subsequent decades. The restructuring of reserve forces also reflected Vietnam's lessons. The total force policy integrated reserve and National Guard units into operational plans. The idea was that major deployments would require calling up reserves. This would ensure that military action had broader public support. politicians would face pressure from communities losing their National Guard units. This was meant to prevent presidents from waging wars without public consent. The policy had mixed success in achieving this goal. The intelligence community faced its own reckoning after Vietnam. The CIA and other agencies had consistently overestimated American progress in the war. The body count metrics had been inflated. Enemy strength had been underestimated. Intelligence analysts had told policymakers what they wanted to hear rather than objective truth. The intelligence failures contributed to poor decision-making. Reforms were implemented to improve analytical independence and reduce politicization. These reforms had varying degrees of success. The media's role in covering war changed fundamentally because of Vietnam. Early in the war, reporters had relatively free access to combat zones. They could move around the country and file stories with minimal censorship. As the war progressed and coverage became more critical, the military blamed the media for undermining public support. The stabbed-in-the-back narrative claimed that America could have won if the media had not turned the public against the war. This narrative ignored the war's genuine failures but gained traction among conservatives. Subsequent military operations imposed much tighter media restrictions. During the 1983 invasion of Grenada, the press was excluded entirely. In the 1989 invasion of Panama, media access was severely limited. The Persian Gulf War in 1991 introduced the embedded journalist program. Reporters were assigned to specific military units. They could report on what those units did, but had limited broader perspective. This gave the military more control over the narrative while maintaining the appearance of press access. The credibility gap that emerged during Vietnam permanently altered Americans' trust in government. The Pentagon Papers revealed systematic deception. The gap between official optimism and battlefield reality had been enormous. Politicians and generals had known the war was going badly while telling the public it was being won. This deception, once exposed, created lasting cynicism about government statements. Trust in government plummeted during the Vietnam era and never fully recovered. Watergate compounded the damage. The scandal that destroyed Nixon's presidency had its roots in Vietnam-era paranoia. The plumbers unit that burglarized the Democratic headquarters had previously burglarized Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. The mentality that led to illegal surveillance and dirty tricks in Vietnam extended to domestic politics. When Watergate unraveled, it confirmed that the government lied and broke laws. The combined impact of Vietnam and Watergate created a generation of cynics. The anti-war movement's legacy was complex and contested. The movement had helped end American involvement in Vietnam. It had mobilized millions of Americans to political action. It had forced the government to change course. But the movement's tactics and rhetoric had also alienated many Americans. The divisions it exposed never fully healed. The characterization of anti-war protesters as unpatriotic troublemakers persisted for decades. Some veterans blamed protesters for undermining the war effort and causing American defeat. The cultural impact of the anti-war movement extended beyond Vietnam. The movement contributed to broader social changes in the 1960s and 1970s. It energized the women's movement, the environmental movement, and other progressive causes. The tactics of mass protest and civil disobedience became standard tools of political activism. The mobilization techniques developed by anti-war organizers were adopted by subsequent movements. Vietnam protest culture shaped American political activism for generations. The draft resistance movement had its own lasting effects. Tens of thousands of young men refused induction or fled to Canada to avoid service. President Jimmy Carter granted amnesty to draft evaders in 1977. This allowed them to return without facing prosecution. But the amnesty was controversial. Veterans groups opposed it. They felt it rewarded cowardice and punished those who had served. The debate over draft resistance touched fundamental questions about duty, conscience, and citizenship. Vietnam-era draft resistors defended their actions on moral grounds. They argued the war was illegal and immoral. They claimed a moral obligation to refuse participation in war crimes. Some faced imprisonment for their convictions. Others lived in exile for years. Their principled stand won respect from some quarters and scorn from others. The debate over their legacy continued for decades. Were they cowards who avoided duty or heroes who stood against injustice? The African American experience in Vietnam deserves particular attention. Black soldiers served in disproportionate numbers, especially in combat roles. They suffered higher casualty rates than their percentage of the population. The civil rights movement and Black Power movement influenced how African American soldiers viewed the war. Some questioned why they were fighting for freedom abroad when they lacked full rights at home. Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve resonated deeply in the black community. Racial tensions within the military increased as the war dragged on. Conflicts between black and white soldiers sometimes erupted into violence. The military had to address racial issues it had long ignored. Integration of the armed forces had occurred only in the 1950s. Vietnam exposed the limitations of that integration. The military implemented programs to reduce racial tension and improve understanding. These efforts had mixed success, but represented recognition of the problem. The Vietnamese American community developed complex relationships with Vietnam War memory. First-generation refugees who had fled communism generally maintained anti-communist politics. They commemorated the fall of Saigon as Black April, a day of mourning. They flew the South Vietnamese flag and preserved the memory of the lost republic. They opposed normalization of relations with communist Vietnam. They saw themselves as exiles waiting for eventual return to a free Vietnam. Second and third generation Vietnamese Americans had more complicated identities. They grew up American but maintained cultural connections to Vietnam. Many visited Vietnam as tourists or to connect with extended family. They did not share their parents' lived experience of the war. They could appreciate both Vietnamese and American perspectives. This created generational tensions within families about how to remember and honor the past. The boat people crisis of the late 1970s and 1980s brought new waves of Vietnamese refugees. After the war ended, life under communist rule proved harsh. The economy collapsed. Political repression was severe. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled by sea in small boats. Many drowned or were killed by pirates. Those who survived landed in refugee camps in Southeast Asia. International resettlement eventually brought many to the United States and other countries. The boat people refugees differed from the 1975 evacuees. They were more likely to be ethnic Chinese or from rural backgrounds. They had fewer connections to the American presence in Vietnam. Their escapes were more desperate and traumatic. Integration into American society posed different challenges. But they too built new lives and contributed to Vietnamese American communities. Their stories added layers to the Vietnamese diaspora narrative. The legacy of the war in Vietnam itself took complex forms. The unified Vietnam under communist rule faced enormous challenges. The economy was devastated by decades of war. The American embargo isolated the country diplomatically and economically. The regime's ideological rigidity hindered development. Living standards remained low for years. Many Vietnamese wondered if victory had been worth the cost. The Doi Moi reforms of 1986 began Vietnam's transformation. The communist leadership acknowledged that socialist economic policies had failed. They introduced market reforms while maintaining political control. This model resembled China's approach. The economy began to grow, living standards gradually improved. Vietnam opened to foreign investment and trade. The transformation was slow but steady. Today's Vietnam is vastly different from the war-torn country of the 1970s. The economy has grown rapidly. Cities have modernized dramatically. Vietnam has become a manufacturing hub and tourist destination. The younger generation has no memory of the war. They are focused on education, careers, and prosperity. The war is history to them, not lived experience. This generational shift has changed Vietnam's relationship with its past. The Vietnamese government maintains tight control over how the war is remembered. The official narrative celebrates the victory over American imperialism. Museums and memorials present the war from the communist perspective. Former South Vietnamese soldiers and officials are largely written out of the story. The suffering caused by communist policies is minimized. This one-sided narrative serves the regime's legitimacy but distorts historical understanding. American veterans visiting Vietnam have had mixed experiences. Some found healing by returning to the places where they fought. Meeting former enemies as fellow human beings helped process trauma. Vietnamese people generally welcomed American veterans warmly. They distinguished between soldiers following orders and the policies they opposed. This generosity surprised many veterans. It challenged their assumptions about Vietnamese attitudes. Other veterans found return visits distressing. Seeing the country they had tried to defend under communist rule was painful. Witnessing how their sacrifices had been for nothing was difficult to accept. The transformation of Vietnam into a modern country made the war seem even more senseless in retrospect. If Vietnam could develop into a prosperous nation anyway, what had the war accomplished? The debate over whether the war was winnable continues among historians and veterans. Some argue that better strategy could have succeeded. They point to the Viet Cong's near destruction after Tet as a missed opportunity. They argue that the linebacker bombing campaigns of 1972 should have been conducted earlier. They believe that restricting the bombing of North Vietnam had prolonged the war unnecessarily. This counterfactual analysis suggests the war could have been won with different decisions. Other historians argue the war was fundamentally unwinnable. They point to the South Vietnamese government's lack of legitimacy. They note that no amount of American military power could create a viable South Vietnamese nation. They argue that Vietnamese nationalism was the decisive factor. Ho Chi Minh and the Communists successfully portrayed themselves as defenders of Vietnamese independence. America and South Vietnam could not overcome this narrative advantage. From this perspective, the war was doomed from the start. The moral debate over the war remains contentious. Was American intervention justified by the threat of communist expansion? Or was it an unjust war of aggression against a nationalist movement? Did America fight nobly for freedom or commit atrocities in an immoral cause? These questions have no universally accepted answers. They depend on fundamental values and political perspectives. The Vietnam War remains a Rorschach test of American values. The comparison between Vietnam and subsequent conflicts is inevitable. Was Iraq another Vietnam? Is Afghanistan? These comparisons are both illuminating and limited. Each conflict has unique circumstances, but certain patterns recur. Overconfidence in military solutions to political problems, unreliable local allies, difficulty distinguishing enemies from civilians, mission creep and escalation. These Vietnam patterns appeared in later wars. The lessons of Vietnam should have prevented repeating its mistakes. Yet America found itself in similar situations in Iraq and Afghanistan. This suggests that institutional memory is weak, or that political and bureaucratic incentives override historical lessons. Each generation of leaders seems to believe it will avoid the mistakes of the past. Each seems to discover anew the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. The cost of the Vietnam War continues to compound. The direct financial cost of $160 billion in 1970s money translates to well over $1 trillion in current dollars. But the indirect costs are incalculable, the opportunity cost of resources spent on war rather than domestic needs. The social cost of a divided nation, the human cost of broken lives and broken families. These costs continued accruing long after the last American left Saigon. The environmental legacy of the war will persist for generations. Dioxin contamination from Agent Orange remains in Vietnamese soil and water. Hot spots around former military bases are particularly contaminated. Cleanup efforts have made progress, but much remains to be done. The United States has provided funding for cleanup and healthcare. But the scale of contamination means complete remediation may never be achieved. Unexploded ordnance continues to kill and injure people in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Farmers plowing fields strike bombs buried decades ago. Children find cluster bomb bullets that look like toys and are maimed when they explode. Clearing this ordnance is dangerous, slow work. International organizations and the United States have supported clearance efforts. But millions of acres remain contaminated. The war's explosive remnants will kill for generations to come. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial has become a site of pilgrimage and reflection for millions. People come to find names of loved ones lost in the war. They leave mementos and letters. They make rubbings of names. The memorial has spawned similar designs for other conflicts and tragedies. Its impact on memorial design and public commemoration has been profound. Maya Lin's vision created a new language for honoring the dead. The annual commemoration at the memorial brings together veterans, families, and officials. These ceremonies provide space for grief and remembrance. They allow the nation to honor those who served without making political statements about the war itself. This separation of honoring service from judging the war's rightness was an important development. It allowed healing that had been delayed by polarization. Vietnam War literature and film continue to appear decades after the conflict ended. Each generation reinterprets the war through its own lens. The literature has evolved from immediate processing to deeper historical analysis. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried and other works explore the war's psychological and moral dimensions. These stories keep the war's memory alive and relevant. Recent films like Da 5 Bloods 2020 have explored African American experiences in Vietnam. They examine how black soldiers processed fighting for a country that denied them equality. They show how the war intersected with the civil rights struggle. These stories had been underrepresented in earlier Vietnam War narratives. Their telling enriches understanding of the war's complexity. The Vietnam War's place in American memory continues to evolve. For those who lived through it, the war remains deeply personal. For younger generations, it is history like World War II or the Civil War. The emotional intensity has faded as participants age and pass away. But the war's lessons remain relevant. As long as America debates its role in the world, Vietnam will be invoked. The 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon in 2025 prompted renewed reflection. Documentaries and articles examined what had been learned and what remained unresolved. Veterans in their 70s shared their stories while they still could. Historians debated whether enough time had passed for objective assessment. The anniversary marked both closure and continuing questions. The ultimate lesson of the Vietnam War may be about the limits of power. America possessed overwhelming military superiority. It deployed advanced technology and massive firepower. It killed millions of enemy fighters, yet it could not achieve its political objectives. Military power proved insufficient to create a stable, legitimate South Vietnamese government. Force could not substitute for political solutions. This lesson has been repeatedly forgotten and relearned. The Vietnam War demonstrated that the American people will not support endless wars with unclear objectives. Public support for war erodes when casualties mount without visible progress. This creates political constraints on military action. Presidents who ignore these constraints face domestic political consequences. The war proved that democratic publics will not grant unlimited time and resources for military adventures. The war also showed the importance of understanding local conditions and culture. American policymakers consistently misunderstood Vietnamese society and history. They imposed Cold War frameworks on a nationalist struggle. They underestimated the appeal of Vietnamese independence. They overestimated the viability of the South Vietnamese government. These misjudgments flowed from ignorance and arrogance. They illustrate the importance of cultural and historical knowledge in foreign policy.